Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the committee for having us. We look forward to, of course, hearing from and having been heard from all of our witnesses, so thank you very much. Before joining Congress, I served as mayor of Long Beach, California. It's a city of about 500,000 people, coastal community. I was mayor during the entire time of the pandemic and the emergency. I also happen to be very proud of the response that we had as a community to this pandemic. President Biden called our response locally in Long Beach a national model. The governor of California said it was the best response from a city in the state of California. In fact, we were the first community to vaccinate 99% of our seniors. We're the first community to vaccinate all of our public school teachers in our school system. And we were the first city to reopen our public schools as a school system in the state of California. So I lived the pandemic 24 hours a day, every single day since it started. And I think it's important as we have this hearing and others on this important topic, because I know that the issue around the pandemic and our response will continue to be an important topic for the Congress. It's important to remember that this emergency was a catastrophic loss of life event. We've lost over a million Americans across this country, and just in Long Beach alone, we've lost over 1,300 residents, friends, families, and neighbors. Personally, I lost both my mom and my stepfather to the pandemic. My mom was a healthcare worker. And so the loss is real for a lot of us. We also saw our economy collapse. Jobs were lost, businesses were closed, folks became unhoused. And families and kids were greatly impacted, particularly around schooling and their ability to learn every single day. Now, there's been a lot of attacks by the Republicans on this committee and across the House on the Biden administration and our response, on the work that's happening in our agencies. I think it's really important to also note that we had a catastrophic emergency and that the President, the Vice President, and all the folks in our agencies did and are doing their best job that they can to manage this emergency. So I want to thank the President for his response. I want to thank his continuous work that's happening right now in our recovery. A lot of folks don't realize that the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan saved lives. It saved small businesses, it saved cities, it saved nonprofits. The money that was sent to us by the federal government kept cities like Long Beach afloat and countless others across the country. It allowed us to provide food for those that were hungry. It allowed us to keep people in their homes with tenant and rental assistance. It allowed us to open homeless shelters where people were falling into homelessness. It allowed us to provide small business grants to small businesses that needed to stay open, to restaurants that were about to close. And so I am grateful to all of you that were involved in some type of oversight or implementation. I'm grateful to the federal government for providing support for our cities. And most importantly, the money from the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan provided opportunities for us to test, to vaccinate, and to keep workers employed. It's important to know that in any major crisis or emergency, there are going to be mistakes. We were all moving fast and quickly. We take them seriously and we learn from them. In California, for example, we've already seized or recovered over $1 billion in fraud and abuse. I think it's important to know that mistakes in emergencies are going to happen. But it's also to know who should be held accountable for some of these concerns being brought up by my Republican colleagues. And if Comptroller DiNardo can just remind us, who was actually president when the pandemic started?
President Trump.
Thank you for that, because I remember as mayor how difficult it was to get any sort of support from the White House. There was no PPE, we weren't getting our masks on time, we had to go procure tests ourselves, and so I am sympathetic that oftentimes in emergencies, things are going to be difficult. Us as a city had to spend $20 million of our own money immediately without knowing if we were going to get reimbursed or having support from FEMA just to keep people alive on the ground. And to Assistant Director Smith, which administration actually established the COVID-19 Fraud Enforcement Task Force?
Sir, we were protecting President Trump at the beginning of the pandemic.
But then I believe President Biden actually put in place an additional committee on fraud and abuse on the pandemic. So I say that because there's obviously going to be mistakes made across administrations, but I'm grateful to the Biden-Harris administration today for actually trying to do as best they can to address some of the abuses that are happening. I also think it's important to put the entire context of what we're talking about in this idea that we've just experienced the single largest loss of life event in the modern era of our country. So I want to thank the three of you for your service, and I want to thank the committee for bringing this up in this hearing. I yield back the rest of my time.
Before I recognize the next member, Mr. Dodaro, you said there were $137 billion in unobligated COVID funds that are
I
still
believe it's 157 billion.
$157 billion.
Yeah.
How much, if you have a general estimate of the total amount of unobligated funds in all agency accounts, regardless of what they were there for? Do you have an idea of what's out there?
You mean for all federal?
Yeah.
spending?
And unobligated funds?
I don't have any idea on that right now. I can find out and provide it for the record.
I would appreciate it if you would provide that.
It's a big government.
Yeah. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from South Carolina, Ms. Mays, for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the ranking member for this hearing today. And the partisanship and the politics of this hearing is absolute and complete BS. Our country and the entire world faced a pandemic unlike anything our generation has ever faced. And some decisions were made that were good, and some decisions were made that I'm sure we're going to look back on 20 years from now and have a great heartburn over, like all of the fraud that's been committed. You know, partisanship in politics has kept us from doing our job on oversight. It keeps us from doing our job in Congress. It keeps our federal agencies from being able to be the best that they can be. And any time that the federal government spends trillions of dollars, we should ensure it's safekeeping regardless of who is in power. COVID-19 is not the fault of this administration or the past administration at all, but it's up to us. I mean, the spending and the fraud has been a product of Republicans and Democrats for generations and for decades. We've got to ensure that the safekeeping of this money is done better now than ever before. There was guidance from federal agencies on how to allocate these funds. The guidance was vague. It led to potential integrity concerns and opportunities for bad actors seeking to take advantage. And I know that at the time this was rushed and there was an urgency because of the worldwide emergency. But even with these concerns, the money kept flowing. As the last two COVID relief spending bills added to the sum total of $1.15 trillion payments to individuals, just over $1 trillion to unemployment when we literally paid people to stay home. No wonder none of us should be surprised it was hard to get people out of their homes and back to work. And we had $779 billion for PPP loans, a total of about $5 trillion was spent roughly on COVID relief. As of today, there have been over 1,000 people convicted of fraud relating to COVID-19 problems, while over 600 are currently facing similar federal charges. And it sounds like by the testimony today, there might be thousands of more charged in the years ahead. And I appreciate everyone's testimony today, coming here and being forthright with our committee. Today, I'm encouraged by our leadership on oversight that we will leave no stone unturned to uncover waste, fraud, and abuse plaguing these programs. And the thing that I found, I think, most interesting to me in the testimony today is the data issues that we as a federal government have. You mentioned, Mr. Horowitz, about having to subpoena 50 states for data. And it doesn't matter if we're dealing with immigration or we're dealing with COVID relief fraud or we're dealing with background checks on bad guys trying to buy guns. We have a real problem with data integrations, our systems talking to one another, our legacy technology that's being utilized. And if we don't fix it soon, we're just going to be overrun with it. So I appreciate some of the ideas that have been put forth. But one of the things that does intrigue me, and I think it probably intrigues a lot of people, and this is in the few moments that I have left in the committee today, is the use of artificial intelligence in some of this and trying to find the fraud. And of course, now we all know about it since ChatGPT, 1 million users in the first 5 days, and only growing exponentially. And they're not the only ones. I mean, there's GitHub and Copilot and a bunch of others. But I would just, my questions today, and I'll start with you, Mr. Horowitz. Can you explain the type of work, how is AI being used? Is it advantageous? Is it speeding up the process? How useful is it? Just some of your feedback with the use of AI in detecting fraud.
Yeah, and thank you, Congressman. It's a very important question you raise, and I think at the outset people need to be cautious about it. We've also read about some of the cautions in using AI. I know IGs are doing oversight work in that space. GAO is as well. But it can be very helpful, and in fact, it's just a further advancement at some level of the analytics that we're using to try and find issues and anomalies and problems and things we should be following up on. So, for example, we used a more primitive form of AI at the outset to try and help the SBA Inspector General, because they were getting in one day 1,000 or more complaints, which was more than they had gotten in the prior year in total. They needed to try and figure out and triage those. What were the highest level, most important ones? They came to the PRAC. We helped them triage that by using a form of, if you will, AI, far more primitive than what you mentioned. But those are the kinds of things we can do. It's something that we have to do as a government-wide. Agencies need to use it. Inspectors general need to use it. I know GAO uses it. It's the future of oversight.
Thank you, and I've run out of time, but I look forward to working with you all as the new subcommittee chairman on tech, cyber, and government innovation. It's going to be a huge marker for us to determine waste, fraud, and abuse in the future, and I agree. Thank you for your time today.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad that we're starting this committee talking about waste, fraud, and abuse and how we can make government work better for the people. You know, Mr. Chairman, the previous comments, I agree with the initial comment that we need to take the politics out of the discussion, take the politics out of this and the posturing and the hyperbole, so that way we can work together, again, to modernize our government and make it work for the people. And I hope this committee will continue to look into other financial abuses, such as wage theft and corporate welfare, as we continue over the next 2 years. Assistant Director Smith, you know, we've heard a lot of hyperbole and political posturing from this committee today. I think the way that we communicate and talk about an issue is extremely important in finding the solution. You know, we've heard things like the greatest theft in our country's history. I'm curious, from the point of view from law enforcement, does that type of hyperbole when talking about crime work to exacerbate the issue?
Sir, thank you for the question. I think it's inconsequential to the bad guys as a law enforcement professional. Bad actors exploit situations no matter what the political climate is. So we focus on investigating violations of identity theft fraud, wire fraud, and bank fraud.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Mr. Dodaro, is it Dodaro, right? Yeah, okay. All the GAO's recommendations include increasing the capacity and resources of the federal government to help deal with the waste, fraud, and abuse. You know, oversight isn't just talking about an issue, you know, we have to solve it. And in the spirit of solving it, can real improvements be made without additional resources and money to the government, to these departments and agencies, so that way they are set up for success to deal with the issues?
Yeah. Some of them can be made without additional resources. Some need additional resources, such as the IG community, to continue their investigations on fraud, but also to set up this analytics center. And so, you know, it's really a mixture of both.
Do you think that the amount of resources that were allocated during the previous administration was sufficient enough for what we were dealing with?
I think there was adequate money given. I think it was just a choice of decisions that were made in some cases. You know, I talked about limitations in the legislation itself. The agencies made decisions that I think could have been different decisions. They were given money to help administer the programs. I think there could have been a little bit more flexibility that was given. I know Treasury's run into some problems recently because they couldn't redistribute the money among some of the programs, particularly new programs, because until you start administering them, you don't know whether it's an adequate allocation or not. Congress fixed that with the latest Consolidation Appropriation Act. But I think by and large, the resources were there. It was just some decisions that were unfortunate.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, you know, on this committee, I've heard a lot of demonizing of Washington bureaucrats, and bureaucrats are often scapegoated. And to be clear, when we talk about bureaucrats, we're talking mainly about working class people who have decided to serve their country by working to power our government. Do you believe that one of the central issues here is that agencies and departments were not set up for success? And I'm thinking specifically about the previous administration. We got into this issue. Do you believe they were set up for success to be able to dole out the amount of money that was being given out?
You know, I think the problem at the outset of the pandemic was, as the Comptroller General has mentioned, the lack of preparedness. Now, understanding this was a 100-year event with the pandemic, but we have emergencies all the time. We have earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, other disaster relief. It happens regularly, not at the scale, perhaps, as this did, but we don't take the steps after an event like this or smaller emergency events to fix what's needed. That was the problem. Just to give you a sense of it, the SBA, Small Business Administration, which administered the PPP and EIDL program, the largest amount of money they had ever given out in a loan program prior to the pandemic was $30 billion. They were giving out $50 billion in a day when the pandemic hit. So when you say, were they ready for success? Well, if you go to an agency that has experience giving out $30 billion over a year, and you say, here's $800 billion, get the money out the door, which was the initial PPP program, that's a recipe for a very challenging situation for no matter who's running the agency.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Yeah, and I think the point here is I agree. We need to prepare for the future here, whether it's a pandemic or anything else. And I'm looking forward to working with my Republican colleagues on ensuring that we give the adequate resources and know-how to our agencies and departments so when this happens again, we're prepared for it. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, thank you for being here. It's actually great to have all the witnesses here in person. This is a novel thing in the 118th Congress, so really appreciate your attendance. A couple of things. It's been stated through the hearing that, we want to make sure that oversight is being conducted, of course, but I would like to remind a lot of my colleagues and a lot of the freshmen who are here for the first time, there was no oversight over any of these dollars in the last Congress. I know that because I sat on this committee, and there were no oversight hearings about anything associated with pandemic spending. So I'm glad that we're tackling this now, and it's critical because the other thing that's kind of in the news cycle, especially today, tomorrow, be with us for a couple months, is we have hit our debt ceiling. We are out of money, folks. $31.5 trillion. We don't have new money. And so if you're going to take account of having to potentially raise the debt ceiling in the United States of America, you have to take account of how the federal government goes through the process of spending its money, whether through normal times or even through pandemic times. Mr. Chairman, I want to submit for the record an article by Politico. The title of the article is Biden Administration Reroutes Billions in Emergency Stockpile COVID Funds to the Border Crunch. That's the article. The article states that the administration went through a process of reappropriating or moving around almost $2 billion from money supposed to go to the Strategic National Stockpile, and also funds intended to help study long COVID that was at the National Institute of Health, and rerouted that to actually help house migrants coming across the southern border because of the president's reckless border policy. So, Mr. Dodaro, are you aware of this reshuffling of dollars from the pandemic emergency to the southern border, in my view, failed strategy of the president?
Yes.
And Mr. Dodaro, when the president made this rerouting, what were some of the uses of funds that it was used for at the southern border?
I don't have that information right now. I'm aware of the situation, what happened, but I don't know, the details.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I will request from you and your office is could you provide the committee those details? Because it's going to be important for the Oversight Committee to understand that when money was shuffled from pandemic response to border policy, which, by the way, was just a unilateral policy shift at the beginning of the Biden administration, that could have put American citizens at risk during the pandemic. And the reason why this is illustrative is because if we go down the line of setting precedents on how funding is going to be used, we should have an idea of what administrations have done in the past. So I think this is actually very critical information. One other point, there is money that came through the American Rescue Plan the $1.9 trillion quote-unquote COVID bailout of the American economy. I say quote-unquote because it really didn't work. But a bunch of that money is actually supposed to go to state and local governments, including to school districts through ESSER funds. Now, Mr. Dodaro, there is another tranche of this money that is slated to go out. This goes to the previous question by Mr. Palmer about obligated funds somewhere to the tune of $500 billion that is slated to go out. And the president has now said that he's going to end the COVID emergency effective May 11th. If the COVID emergency ends effective May 11th, what is going to happen with these ESSER funds that are obligated but have not yet been transmitted?
I'll have our attorneys take a look at that to make sure, because we have appropriation law attorneys that provide assistance. But I think, I'm not sure it's tied, the funding's tied to the National Emergency Declaration in terms of what's been appropriated already. And I know some of the funds are available for use up to 2026, some up to 2030. So I don't know if the termination of the national emergency would trump what is already in the legislation in terms of how available those funds are made. But I'll have our attorneys take a look at it. My guess would be that the appropriation would be the governing factor for the uses of those funds in the future, that they would still be available. But I don't know for sure. I'll double check on that. There are some funding things, particularly in Medicaid, for example, that would have to be changed that are tied to the National Emergency Declaration.
Agreed. Medicaid is one of those things that is tied to the national emergency. I would just proffer for the committee that if we're going to go down this road of having to find a way to raise our debt ceiling, one of the things we should do is we should end letting money go out the door that was tied to the pandemic. That is now essentially over. With that, I yield back.